I wish I could erase from my memory the moment I drove into that forsaken New England town. But it's etched into my mind with merciless clarity. The narrow highway snaked through endless pines, and a dense layer of fog clung to the asphalt like a living shroud. My headlights struggled to pierce the gloom, revealing only brief glimpses of twisted tree trunks and sagging fence posts. It felt as if the road had gone on forever, carrying me deeper into a realm where the rules of the world no longer applied. The instant I crossed into the outer edge of the abandoned district, my pulse throbbed. An old sign, rusted and half collapsed, creaked in the wind. I couldn't make out its faded lettering, but the chill racing up my spine told me I'd found the place. My car's engine seemed to sputter in protest. The radio crackled with static, then went silent, as though the signal had been devoured by the heavy mist. It was a small detail, yet it sent my anxiety through the roof. My search led me to a side street, barely more than a dirt lane pockmarked with puddles of stagnant water. Houses squatted along both sides, windows boarded or shattered, roofs sagging beneath decades of neglect. A street lamp flickered overhead, casting a flicker of dull orange light on peeling paint and rotted shutters. I inhaled deeply to steady my nerves, only to encounter the pungent odor of mold and damp earth. The taste of rot lingered at the back of my throat. I stepped out of the car, and the damp chill immediately clawed at my skin. An oppressively silent atmosphere clung to everything. No birds, no insects, no distant hum of normal life. The only noise was the soft drip of condensation falling from eaves and power line. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A memory tugged at me, some half-forgotten rumor about an entire community that vanished overnight, leaving only questions and foreboding legends. My heart pounded as I flicked on a flashlight and advanced down the deserted street. In the distance, a low rumble rolled through the mist. I froze, straining to identify its source. For a heartbeat, I wondered if thunder signaled an approaching storm. But the sound died abruptly, swallowed by the encroaching fog. My gaze darted from one ruined building to the next. Boards rattled against empty window frames, and somewhere a loose shutter slapped in an uneven rhythm. Each echo gnawed at my composure, reminding me I was utterly alone. At least, that was what I told myself. The deeper I ventured, the thicker the air seemed to become, as though the fog solidified around me. An unsettling sensation tugged at my mind, like being watched by an unseen presence crouched in a dark corner. My flashlight beam shook, capturing fragments of tattered curtains and splintered doors. Each structure looked as if it had been evacuated in a panic, with belongings left strewn about in scenes of chaos. Broken chairs, scattered newspapers, family portraits cracked underfoot. I caught sight of a rag doll lying face down in a gutter, its button eyes grimy and dull. My pulse galloped when I heard a sudden hiss, like a whisper carried on the wind. I swept the flashlight in a wide arc, but saw nothing besides shifting curtains of fog. Way! Another hiss, closer now, raised the hair on my neck. I wanted to believe it was only my frayed nerves, but my instincts insisted otherwise. It felt as though something was deliberately staying just out of sight, studying me. I forced myself to keep moving until I reached a crumbling, two-story building near the end of the street. Its architecture suggested it might have been a modest inn or boarding house. The sign above the door had fallen off, leaving only rusty nails jutting from warped wood. A cluster of footprints trailed across the muddy yard, leading from the road straight to the front steps. They looked fresh, the edges too defined to be more than a day old. Because I swallowed hard. If someone else was out here, I had to find them. I ascended the rickety steps, each board creaking and bending under my weight. The door hung ajar, revealing a narrow hallway beyond. A dank draft drifted out, carrying the stench of decay and mildew. Stepping inside, I felt as though I'd violated a crypt. My flashlight exposed flaking wallpaper and a dusty countertop. A stack of old letters lay scattered in a corner, and I knelt to read the top envelope. The ink had run, smudging the name. The only visible word was urgent. A sudden noise behind me made me jolt, a dragging scrape like furniture being moved across the floor. I whirled around, shining my beam back toward the entryway. Empty space and swirling fog greeted me, but the sound continued for another second before abruptly stopping. My heart hammered, and I realized I was holding my breath, mustering what little courage I had left. I followed the noise down a hallway that stretched farther into darkness. The corridor felt endless, lined with closed doors on either side, most of them splintered or off their hinges. My skin prickled as a draft crept through a crack in the wall. Just then I noticed something odd. A faint set of footprints marking the dusty floor, leading toward a staircase at the far end. They were small, possibly from a child. My gut twisted at the thought of a child surviving in this desolate place. Cautious and tense, I reached the foot of the stairs, shining my light upward. The banister was broken, the steps caked in a thin layer of debris. A rancid smell drifted down, like something left to spoil in a forgotten attic. I took a tentative step upward, the wood sagging beneath me. About halfway up, I paused, listening intently. An almost imperceptible scratching noise came from above, followed by a whisper so soft I couldn't catch the words. Against all logic, I kept climbing, compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity that made my legs feel like lead. The narrow hallway at the top seemed even gloomier, the walls eaten away by damp rot. One door stood partially open, a wedge of flickering light shining through, too weak to be an electric bulb. My pulse quickened. No electricity should have been running in this abandoned shell of a building. Yet there it was, an unsteady glow dancing on the rotted floorboards. I inched closer, bracing myself for whatever might be inside. And the threshold felt like a boundary between reality and something far darker. As I pushed the door open, my flashlight caught a glimpse of tattered curtains drawn across a cracked window. A single candle burned on a makeshift table, illuminating a clutter of old photographs, fragments of newspapers, and an old radio covered in dust. The slow drip of condensation from the ceiling splattered into a puddle near the center of the room. A shape loomed in the corner, and my heart nearly burst. It was a figure, hunched against the peeling wallpaper, facing away from me. Its clothes were filthy, hair matted in tangled clumps. I suppressed a gasp, stepping forward despite my body's pleading to turn and run. The figure's shoulders twitched, as though sensing my presence. Then, with agonizing slowness, it swiveled its head in my direction, revealing a face streaked with grime and something else I couldn't identify in the dim light. My knees threatened to buckle, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. In that suffocating moment, I understood that I was finally seeing the living soul behind those footprints outside. Yet, there was something fundamentally wrong about the way the figure moved. The way it seemed to shimmer in the candlelight. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words died in my throat. A rasping exhalation escaped the figure's lips, filling the silence with an unearthly hiss, and I felt my grip on the flashlight slip. Everything I'd ever doubted about the horrific rumors began crashing into me, a tidal wave of terror. My mind screamed to escape, but my legs refused. The candle guttered, casting wavering shadows along the walls, and as that hunched shape rose to its feet, I realized, too late, that I'd stumbled into a reality far worse than any story I could have imagined. I barely managed to keep my grip on the flashlight as that hunched shape straightened, each movement unnervingly slow. The candle's flame quivered, sending jittery shadows across the walls. In that dim, wavering light, I recognized the outline of a human figure. Yet something about it felt off, like the bones and flesh were arranged at subtly wrong angles. My breath came in quick, shallow gasps, and I willed myself not to collapse under the weight of the fear clawing through my gut. A brittle scraping sound broke the silence, and the figure began to turn. Its head pivoted with a soft crack, revealing features that still defied clarity. Wet strands of hair clung to gaunt cheeks, and the skin had an unhealthy pallor, slick with something akin to sweat. I saw a flicker of recognition in eyes that seemed too wide, reflecting the wavering candlelight in a way that left them strangely hollow. The corners of its mouth twitched, as though testing the act of forming words or an expression. A strangled noise gurgled in its throat, and I stumbled backward until my shoulder hit the ruined wall. Something sharp poked my spine where the plaster had crumbled, forcing me to shift. My flashlight beam danced wildly, illuminating disjointed snapshots. The damp ceiling above, the water-stained pages scattered on the floor, and the figure creeping closer as if curious or compelled. I couldn't decide which possibility terrified me more. And a trickle of moisture dripped from the corner of its mouth, and a raspy breath rattled in the stillness. The candle sputtered, nearly going out, then flared again, illuminating a monstrous glimpse of sunken eyes and flaking skin, a smell of stale earth and mold radiated from it, the odor so intense that I almost gagged. My mind reeled. How long had it been here, crouched in this forgotten room? More importantly, what was it surviving on? A sudden surge of adrenaline overrode my paralysis, and I lunged sideways, desperate to put distance between me and that living nightmare. My flashlight flickered, but I clung to it as if it were a lifeline. The figure let out a trembling hiss that reverberated through the cramped space. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I needed to see, needed to confirm it wasn't just a trick of my imagination. My steps carried me toward a warped window, sealed from the outside by plywood. I spotted a narrow gap between two boards, just big enough for a slice of the fog-enshrouded street. Outside to show through. The candle's glow barely reached that far, leaving the corners of the room cloaked in pitch-black darkness. For a second, I contemplated smashing my way out, but the boards looked solid, and my arms felt too shaky to guarantee success. Meanwhile, the figure advanced another step, making that scraping noise with every movement. A memory of fresh footprints in the mud flashed in my mind, and I realized I might not be dealing with some ghost or long-departed spirit. This thing was physical enough to leave tracks outside. I twisted my head, scanning for another exit, and saw a narrow doorway leading deeper into the building. A wave of indecision washed over me. Fleeing blindly down a hallway might corner me in an even worse situation. But remaining here seemed like a sure way to lose myself, to panic. The figure let out a breathy moan that frayed my nerves further. My thoughts churned, recalling the fleeting glimpses of a tattered doll in the gutter, the ominous hush that had blanketed this entire street. Had this entity stalked the abandoned houses all along, waiting for someone foolish enough to enter? I shuddered at the possibility, then forced myself to inch sideways toward that doorway, staying just beyond arm's reach of the shape in the center of the room. A cold draft wound through the hallway behind me, stirring motes of dust that sparkled in the flashlight's unsteady beam. I kept my gaze trained on the figure, heart pounding. The air thickened with a tension I could almost taste, as though the entire building leaned in, holding its breath for the next move. My mouth felt so dry that swallowing was painful. I took another step back. The floorboards groaned loudly, announcing my attempt to escape. The figure jerked its head sharply, and for one heart-stopping moment, our eyes locked. Its pupils dilated, an alien intelligence flickering behind the emptiness. I'd never felt more like prey in my life. Every fiber of my body screamed that it was time to run, but the fear rooted my feet in place. A scraping shuffle broke the stalemate. Il seal Bakri. It slid forward with unnatural grace, bridging the gap faster than I anticipated. My pulse thundered as I wheeled around, plunging into the darkness of the hallway. Behind me, a clatter echoed, and I could almost imagine skeletal fingers clutching at the air where I'd stood. My shoes slapped against the warped floor, kicking up dust and debris, but I refused to slow down. A single misstep could drop me through rotten boards or send me barreling into collapsed beams. Yet I risked it anyway, desperate to escape that inhuman presence. The hallway spiraled deeper into shadow, twisting with corners that made no architectural sense. Vast, ruined doors leading to rooms littered with splintered furniture, each offering no safe refuge. A rancid odor emanated from somewhere unseen, making my stomach churn. The walls seemed to close in with every step, the corridor becoming narrower, until my shoulders nearly brushed the mildewed wallpaper. My flashlight flickered again, and I slammed its casing with my palm. The beam steadied, but I couldn't shake the dread that my only source of light might fail at the worst possible moment. Behind me, that rasping hiss echoed once more, closer than I wanted to believe. A part of me regretted not leaping through the window, but it was too late to second guess. My lungs burned, and a cold sweat drenched my shirt. The hallway veered left, ending in a battered door that had partially fallen off its hinges. I squeezed through the gap, wincing as rough splinters dug into my sleeve. Beyond the door lay what must have been a back stairwell, its steps descending into pitch-black depths. A stale draft drifted upward, carrying the scent of wet concrete and rotting wood. My flashlight revealed a landing strewn with broken tiles and a toppled metal cabinet. I heard scratching sounds from behind me, growing louder. The figure, if it could still be called that, wasn't giving up. I sucked in a shaky breath and considered my options. Going down meant venturing even further from the outside world. But staying put promised a swift end to whatever hope I had left. My head pounded, adrenaline urging me onward, while my rational mind screamed for caution. The memory of that twisted face and those searching eyes propelled me forward, across the landing, and on to the first step. Each riser groaned in protest, rattling dust from overhead pipes. In the flickering halo of my flashlight, I caught sight of cryptic scratches etched into the walls, as though someone had gouged symbols or letters in a desperate attempt to communicate. The lines made no sense, swirling in chaotic patterns that pricked at my imagination. My heart drummed a relentless beat as I descended another step, straining my ears for any hint of pursuit. The scraping continued, and I sensed the presence at the top of the stairs, maybe just around the bend. Every nerve in my body vibrated with raw panic, but I forced myself down another step, determined to escape the suffocating shadow that had overtaken the upper floors. The darkness below yawned wide, offering no guarantee of safety, only the slimmest chance to evade whatever horror lurked above. Without looking back, I moved deeper into the murk, the corridor's damp walls pressing in as I navigated the narrow staircase. The air felt colder, the gloom heavier. Each creak of a step sounded like a countdown echoing through the deserted inn, reminding me that my choices were narrowing with every passing second. I reached the landing at the bottom of the stairwell, gasping for air in the oppressive darkness. dew. The floor was slick with moisture that seeped between crooked tiles, forcing each step to be painfully cautious. My flashlight beam jumped and wavered across the walls, revealing stains that resembled sprawling mold or strange organic growth. I had the uneasy sense of venturing into a place untouched by daylight for far too long. A drip from overhead echoed sharply, and I realized water was leaking through a ruptured pipe. The droplets splashed on the cracked floor in a steady rhythm that only magnified the silence between each beat. My pulse roared in my ears, and I wondered whether the shape upstairs could hear it too, tracking me through the gloom like a predator homing in on wounded prey. At the far end of the landing, a corridor extended to the left. The passage was narrow, with walls built of cinder blocks. Patches of paint clung stubbornly here and there, curling at the edges as if scorched. A musty breeze brushed my face, carrying an unpleasant tang that made me cover my mouth. The flashlight caught glimmers of broken glass on the ground, possibly from light fixtures that once illuminated this space. I tried not to crunch the shards beneath my shoes, unwilling to make more noise than absolutely necessary. I edged forward, half expecting the floor to drop out from under me at any moment. A rusted metal door appeared on my right, slightly ajar, squeaking on its hinges when I nudged it with my flashlight. Beyond the doorway lay a cramped storeroom lined with dusty shelves. Jars and cans were scattered across the floor, their labels long faded. Most were rusted shut, contents impossible to identify. I spotted a toppled metal rack in one corner, forming a jagged barricade. The idea of barricading myself here flitted through my mind, but a sense of dread told me this place offered no genuine security. Another sound reached me, so faint it might have been my imagination. A hushed scraping, like fingernails dragging across a concrete wall. My heartbeat hammered, and I cast the flashlight toward the corridor behind me. The darkness looked back, unfathomable and full of possibilities I had no desire to confront. Summoning a shred of courage, I eased the storeroom door shut, hoping to muffle any trace of my presence. The hinges groaned, and a metallic clang echoed in the stale air. My nerves stretched thinner with each second. I noticed an old fuse box on the wall, its cover dangling by a single screw. I flicked it open, trying to see if there was any hope of restoring power. But most of the wiring had been yanked out, leaving a tangle of exposed cables. Perhaps the building's electricity had been cut when everyone fled, or maybe something else had severed it deliberately. Either way, the emptiness gnawed at me, a stark reminder that I was alone in a place where normal rules no longer seemed to apply. I pushed deeper along the corridor, stepping around a puddle that gleamed with an oily sheen in my flashlight's glow. The path bent sharply to the right, leading into another set of stairs that descended even farther. My throat constricted at the sight of them. I'd gone down enough steps already, venturing far beyond any normal sense of safety. Still, I couldn't bring myself to turn around. not with that ghastly presence lurking somewhere behind me. A broken sign lay face down on the floor, near the top step. I turned it over, careful not to slice my hand on the jagged edges. N. That faded letters spelled out something about a maintenance level, but the rest was too smeared to read. A surge of hopelessness washed over me. Maintenance per die. That implied a labyrinth of corridors, possibly leading to boiler rooms, storage areas, or hidden places no one had visited in decades. A perfect setting for the horror that had found a home here. Each step downward felt colder, like descending into the belly of some sleeping beast. A stale draught brushed my face, carrying the scent of mildew and rust. The faint scuttling of rats, or something else, echoed through the darkness. Part of me yearned for it to be just rodents. At least rodents made sense in an abandoned structure. My mind kept conjuring worse scenarios, each more monstrous than the last. My flashlight revealed a small landing. On the right, a thick metal door with an industrial-looking wheel handle stood closed. It reminded me of a hatch on a ship, sealed tight to keep water out, or keep something else in. The floor on the door was marred by scratches, as though desperate hands or claws had tried to force it open. I approached, knees trembling, and laid a hand on the cold, flaking metal. No movement, no sound from the other side. That eerie hush only sharpened my panic. A muffled shuffle drifted from above, reverberating down the stairs I'd just descended. My stomach knotted. If the shape that had followed me was still searching, I couldn't afford to linger. I twisted the wheel handle, heart pounding, hoping the door would budge. It resisted for a moment, then groaned open an inch before jamming. With both hands, I pressed my shoulder against it, ignoring the rust that showered my sleeve. Finally, it yielded, scraping across the concrete until I could slip through the gap. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the odor of old machinery. Heavy pipes snaked along the ceiling, dripping condensation onto the grated floor. My flashlight flickered, revealing the twisted remains of a boiler or generator in the center of the room. The entire place hummed with a faint vibration, as though some residual energy pulsed through the corroded pipes. I felt it in my chest, an unsettling thrum that set my teeth on edge. Cautiously, I stepped onto the metal grating, hearing it creak beneath my weight. The door slammed shut behind me, and for a heartbeat, I panicked, worried it had locked automatically. I grabbed the wheel handle from the inside, testing it. It spun, albeit with difficulty, so I let out a shaky breath. If necessary, I could still retreat the way I'd come, though that notion brought no real comfort. I inched around the hulking remains of machinery, shining my light into every corner. Wires dangled from broken control panels, and shattered gauges lay scattered like dead eyes across the floor. The sense of intrusion was overwhelming, as though I'd violated a forbidden chamber sealed off for reasons best left undiscovered. A sudden clang from somewhere in the maze of pipes made me startle so hard my flashlight slipped from my grip, clattering onto the metal floor. Its beam spun wildly, projecting skewed shadows up the walls before rolling to a stop. When I picked it up, my hand shook so violently I nearly dropped it again. I wanted to retreat, to find another route, but the corridor outside echoed with a faint scraping that sounded far too close. My mind raced. I could press onward into the depths of this mechanical warren, hoping to find an exit, or at least a safe hiding spot, or I could risk going back upstairs and facing the thing that haunted the halls above. Neither option promised salvation. Gritting my teeth, I lifted the flashlight, stepping carefully over loose cables. The dripping pipes overhead formed a constant, maddening patter that blended with the pounding of my heart. My eyes darted from one dark alcove to the next. Each new shadow threatened to become that hunched figure, its ragged breath filling my ears. Yet, as I continued deeper, I began to sense that something else lurked here. Another presence, maybe older, woven into the walls themselves. A faint, rhythmic thumping emerged from somewhere in the distance, steady and unhurried, like a hidden pulse beneath layers of concrete and steel. My hair stood on end. The corridor narrowed, forcing me to squeeze past a tangle of collapsed ductwork. Rusty metal shredded the sleeve of my jacket, but I barely noticed. My focus was on that insistent sound, drawing me forward like a dark beacon, even as every instinct screamed that I should turn away before it was too late. I followed the echo of that steady thumping, trying to ignore the dank chill seeping into my bones. Each step along the narrowing corridor made my pulse quicken, and the stale air pressed against my lung. Overhead, the ceiling sagged in places, as though weighed down by the accumulated secrets of the building. My flashlight revealed corroded pipes weaving across the walls like veins in a slumbering giant. Water droplets slid down their surfaces, dripping into shallow puddles that reflected the faint glow of my light. The rhythmic sound grew clearer, a resonant beat that seemed to originate from some hidden chamber. My mind churned with questions. Could there be machinery still operating down here? Or was it something else, something that defied explanation? I edged around a collapsed section of ductwork, heart pounding every few yards. A hiss of escaping steam startled me, sending echoes bouncing through the claustrophobic space. The metallic clang of dripping water provided a constant reminder of how far I was from anything resembling safety. I reached a branching intersection where two corridors diverged. A broken sign dangled from the ceiling, its letters peeled away by rust and time. I aimed the flashlight at the options, trying to decide which path might lead me closer to whatever was making that dreadful pulse. Neither route offered comfort. One hallway sloped downward, disappearing into murky darkness. The other angled upward, blocked by a collapsed section of concrete. It looked as though an entire chunk of the floor above had caved in, twisting rebar exposed like skeletal remains. The downward slope beckoned with its faint, persistent beat. I pressed on, acutely aware that the structure under my feet felt unstable. The walls sweated with condensation, and I brushed aside spider webs that stretched in delicate patterns overhead. My mind kept drifting to the thing that had pursued me upstairs, the gaunt figure that no longer seemed entirely human. The memory of those eyes, glistening with malice, drove me onward, as if outrunning that memory was my only hope. The corridor opened into a larger chamber, lined with massive pipes that snaked around a central basin. A pale glow flickered at the far side, not quite natural light, but brighter than the musty darkness around me. The steady thumping reverberated across the metal surfaces, making them vibrate under my touch. I approached the basin, noticing a network of valves and gauges. Most were smashed, the dials stuck at impossible readings. Envelop, etuna. A rancid odor clung to the air, sour and chemical, stinging my nostrils. An enormous panel of fused circuit breakers stood to my left, wires dangling in a tangled mass like severed nerves. A slight warmth pulsed from the panel's base, contradictory to the cold everywhere else. I stepped closer, shining the flashlight on a row of cryptic symbols etched into the metal. Silon. They looked neither random nor like standard maintenance markings, and a chill rippled across my skin at their jagged geometry. Instinct told me they weren't anything an ordinary worker would scratch into a control panel. That persistent thumping was loud enough now to feel through my shoes, a deep vibration that resonated in my chest. Beyond the rusted machinery, the pale light flickered from behind what looked like a makeshift barricade of overturned lockers and sheet metal. My heart hammered as I contemplated. Who, or what, could have built such a barrier deep underground? I forced myself to approach, each footstep echoing against the curved walls. As I neared, I noticed a passageway behind the barricade, just tall enough for a person to crawl through if they moved the debris aside. A thick layer of grime coated everything, suggesting no one had disturbed this place in years. Yet the light persisted, wavering like a dying fluorescent bulb, or maybe the glow of a portable lantern. I swallowed hard, trying to steady the tremor in my hands. If there was any chance of finding help, or at least answers, it lay past that blockade. I edged around the perimeter, testing each slab of metal. Some were wedged tight against battered lockers, forming a crude but solid barrier. My shoulders tensed at the thought of making noise while dismantling it. The memory of that figure upstairs lingered, as did the possibility there might be more of them roaming these halls. My palms grew clammy, but the unstoppable thump urged me on, like a beacon both terrifying and irresistible. Deciding I had no better option, I braced a foot against a support beam and pried at the top locker. Metal screeched against concrete, the sound magnified in the enclosed space. My heart jolted with every echo, convinced I was summoning unwanted attention. After a struggle, the locker gave way, tilting just enough to clear a path. Through the narrow gap, the flickering glow illuminated what looked like another corridor branching to the right. The barrier shifted ominously as I slipped through, threatening to collapse behind me. Inside, The air felt warmer, and the smell changed. It was still unpleasant, but tinged with something organic, a faint aroma I couldn't identify. The corridor walls were slick, forming a claustrophobic tunnel that curved out of sight. The faint glow emanated from small glass fixtures set into the ceiling, some failing and others blinking erratically, like a system on the brink of burnout. My flashlight revealed more of those unsettling symbols, drawn in a rust-colored substance that made my stomach twist. That relentless beat was louder here, echoing off the curved walls in a cadence that raised the hairs on my neck. It was almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat magnified 1,000 times. The floor dipped slightly, hinting that I was traveling deeper below ground. Each step felt like an act of surrender to forces I couldn't comprehend. My muscles ached from tension, but I forced myself forward, terrified of what I might find, yet more terrified of staying ignorant. A turn in the tunnel opened into a circular chamber, ringed by metal platforms and railings. Water dripped steadily from overhead, forming shallow pools on the floor. The flickering lights in the ceiling cast dancing reflections along the walls, giving the space a surreal, pulsing quality. At the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied immediate explanation, like a column of riveted steel rising from a hole in the ground. Pipes fed into it from above, and I could sense the thumping thrumming through its surface. I edged closer, dreading what I might discover. The column hummed with an energy that vibrated through my bones, its metal surface slick with condensation. An access panel on one side was partially ajar, revealing a web of wiring and something else, something disturbingly organic, woven among the cables. I tore my gaze away, breath catching in my throat. This went far beyond any normal industrial function. It felt more like an intrusion from outside logic, embedded in the building's foundations. A noise behind me made my stomach flip. Build to star. If pays. It was a low scrape, like shifting debris, possibly from the barricade I'd moved. My flashlight darted over the entryway, illuminating only emptiness. Yet my heart pounded with renewed fear. I realized I was stranded in the center of this bizarre machine room, uncertain of where to run if that shape, or anything worse, slipped in behind me. As the steady beat thundered through the metal platforms, I braced myself for whatever horrors this subterranean world would unveil next, fully aware there might be no turning back. I pressed my palm against the cold metal column, feeling the thumping vibrate up through my arm. Each pulse reverberated in my head, unsettling in its steadiness. The air seemed charged, thick with an energy I couldn't define. My flashlight's beam jittered across the chamber's curved walls, revealing rivets and tangled pipes coated with grime. A few overhead lights flickered, offering just enough illumination to expose the sheer strangeness of this underground contraption. The uneasy thought crossed my mind that perhaps nothing about this place was ever meant to be seen by outsiders. A faint scuffling sound made me wheel around, heart thudding against my ribs. My flashlight swept the entry passage, but I saw only the leaning barricade of twisted lockers and sheet metal. For a moment, I thought I detected movement behind the clutter, maybe a shifting of shadows. My breath caught in my throat, body tensed, until the silence weighed in again like a heavy shroud. If something was out there, it seemed content to wait. Turning back to the column, I examined the half-open access panel. Wires sprouted in chaotic tangles, weaving around lumps of some fibrous, pulsing matter. I forced down a surge of revulsion. Part of me needed to believe it was just mold or an invasive plant, but the faint rhythmic twitch suggested otherwise. The longer I stared, the more I sensed it was alive in ways no normal fungus or vine could be. My flashlight illuminated patches of a slick, translucent membrane that glistened in the gloom. The sight made my skin crawl. I nearly dropped the light again when a dull metallic clang echoed from the far side of the chamber. Adrenaline flared, and I snatched the beam upward, half expecting that gaunt figure to emerge. Instead, the corridor remained empty. The hiss of steam rose somewhere overhead, and I found myself looking up at the scaffolding circling the chamber's upper reaches. Rusted walkways twisted around massive pipes, forming a precarious maze above. It occurred to me that whatever lurked outside might be watching from a vantage point I hadn't even considered. Glancing back at the access panel, I wrestled with indecision. My logical side insisted that meddling with this bizarre apparatus could spark consequences I couldn't control, but an equally urgent instinct told me that leaving it untouched might be worse, especially if it was fueling the horrors in this building. The steady pounding beneath my feet felt like the pulse of something immense, a living system feeding on the structure around it. Torn between retreat and confrontation, I made my choice. Doing nothing felt more dangerous than at least trying to understand. I crouched beside the exposed wiring, careful not to let my jacket brush the unidentified tissues lining the opening. A small metal lever protruded from a bracket, possibly a latch or switch. My stomach clenched as I considered pulling it, uncertain if I would shut this thing down or trigger an even bigger nightmare. One deep breath later, I braced myself and pushed the lever down. The resulting screech of metal grated against my ears, and the column shuddered under my hand. The rhythmic pounding faltered for a moment, stuttering as if caught off guard. My flashlight beam flickered wildly as vibrations pulsed through the floor. A high-pitched squeal tore through the cavernous room, part mechanical, part organic, leaving me dizzy with alarm. I staggered back, nearly losing my balance on the slick metal grating, and watched the column quake under sudden strain. The overhead lights dimmed, then flared brighter than before, illuminating every grimy surface in a harsh glare. Somewhere above, pipes ruptured, sending plumes of steam cascading in hot bursts. A metal panel tore free from the ceiling and crashed to the walkway, the impact rattling across the chamber. My ears rang. It felt as though I'd awakened something best left undisturbed a force that now threatened to tear the entire structure apart. Behind me, the barricade clattered, as if responding to the seismic shudder. Instinct screamed that I needed to get out before the ceiling caved in, or whatever lived behind this machinery decided to strike. Scrambling around the column, I spotted a narrow gap between two massive conduits, dimly lit by the surging lights. My pulse thrummed in time, with the rapid bursts of pressure escaping from the system. I squeezed through the gap, ignoring the jagged edges of torn sheet metal snagging my clothes. On the other side, a grated catwalk led to a short flight of stairs, climbing toward a higher platform. My legs shook from the onslaught of terror and exhaustion, but I pushed forward. The racket behind me crescendoed, a clamor of grinding metal and scraping vibrations. Each footstep echoed as I climbed, the overhead lamps sputtering in and out of existence. A warm blast of air hit me, scented with burning dust and something more acrid, and the lights surged again, painting the metal walkways in stark, terrifying relief. The catwalk ended at another steel door, this one smaller and riddled with dents. I tested the handle, bracing my shoulder against the frame. It gave way with a tortured groan, opening to a dark corridor, lined with more overhead pipes. The instant I stepped through, the door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the infernal glow from the main chamber. My flashlight blinked, adjusting my eyes back to the gloom. The silence was almost worse than the chaos I'd left behind. Slumping against the wall, I gulped air laced with stale humidity, my muscles protesting every move. My mind swirled with images of that pulsing column, the living filaments sprouting from metal, and the monstrous shriek that echoed in my bones. How could any of this exist unnoticed beneath a seemingly ordinary structure? Yet the evidence surrounded me, undeniable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in concert with the building, guiding these events from the shadows. Straightening up, I shone the flashlight down the corridor ahead. The walls and ceiling dripped with condensation. In the distance, I heard the faint drag of something shifting across the floor. Maybe debris or another barrier. My thoughts drifted to the gaunt figure I'd encountered above, wondering if it had found a path down here. The possibility sent a renewed jolt of fear through my bloodstream. Alhamdulillah, I needed to keep moving, needed to find any hint of an exit before the madness swallowed me entirely. With my legs trembling, I set off once more, resolute but deeply uncertain. The darkness closed in like a living presence, and each echo of my footfall felt like a betrayal of my location. In some distant corridor, I imagined the hush of inhuman breath, coiled and patient, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself again. That single thought kept me pushing forward, step by step, deeper into a truth I could no longer run from. I crept along the corridor, flashlight bobbing in my trembling grip, boots squelching on the damp floor. The door behind me had sealed off the roar of machinery, leaving only a heavy hush that pressed in on every side. Occasionally, a pipe overhead hissed or spat a drop of lukewarm water onto my shoulder, making me flinch at even the slightest contact. My mind reeled with images of that pulsing column, the unearthly shriek when I tampered with the lever, and the unsettling possibility that something was still following me down here. I followed the passage as it curved, the walls narrowing until they threatened to scrape my arms. A crack in the ceiling allowed a frail strip of illumination to slip in, though I couldn't tell if it came from emergency lighting or some other source. My flashlight flickered, the beam glancing over patterns etched into the slick concrete. More of those cryptic markings that suggested a twisted intent behind this structure. Some symbols repeated, jagged lines weaving together as if to form a code. Others were like spirals of rust, too elaborate to be accidental. The corridor split abruptly, one route sloping down toward a stale, foul-smelling darkness, the other rising at a slight angle. The slope downward oozed with rancid water, and my stomach churned at the idea of wading into that stagnant filth. The upward path, while not exactly comforting, seemed marginally less ominous. I forced my breath to steady, deciding quickly. If I hoped for any chance of escape, the higher ground might be the best bet. As I moved that way, the overhead gloom pressed down, thick and almost tangible. A metallic clang behind me made me snap my head around. Flashlight jerking wildly. The corridor behind lay empty, bathed in watery shadows. My heart thundered as I waited, every second stretching into eternity. I heard a soft drip, but nothing more. At last, I turned and continued forward, each footstep slower than the last. My muscles ached from the hours spent running or hiding, and my nerves felt worn to a razor's edge. A single door appeared on my left, made of heavy steel, its surface eaten away by rust. The label overhead was illegible, the letters curled and peeled. Despite my growing dread, I felt compelled to check inside, if only to confirm there wasn't something lurking in wait. Tugging the handle, I fought the urge to recoil at the squeal of corroded hinges. A gust of stale air blasted my face, carrying the scent of burnt wiring and old chemicals. The flashlight beam revealed a low-ceilinged room, crammed with broken shelves, shattered glass, and collapsed cabinets. Some apparatus, maybe an old electrical panel, lay half buried under debris. The place looked like it had been ransacked in haste. Broken jars, their contents long dried and crusted, lined the edges of the floor, and a chalky residue coated the chipped tile. I stepped gingerly over shards of glass, searching for anything that could help me understand the nature of this underground complex. A series of file boxes slumped in one corner, waterlogged beyond recognition. Bah! I tried to lift the topmost one, but it practically disintegrated in my hands. Fragments of paper spilled free, the ink smeared and unreadable. A wave of frustration washed over me. There might have been answers here once, but time had erased them. I flicked my light across the space, catching sight of a battered clipboard pinned under a fallen shelf. Edging over, I pried it loose, the crack of splintering wood echoing in the gloom. The clipboard's pages were mildewed and stuck together. I managed to peel apart the first sheet. Faded text mentioned containment, bio something. and restricted access. An official seal in the corner was too smeared to identify. Enter V. I squinted at the few legible words, my mind racing. Something or someone had used this facility for experiments or containment. But of what? My gut twisted in fresh anxiety, picturing that gaunt figure upstairs or the living mass beneath the column. Was the entire building designed to imprison something beyond human comprehension? I stuffed the clipboard under my arm, unwilling to leave behind any scrap of information, no matter how decayed. A strange rustling sound made me freeze. A soft scratch like fabric moving against concrete. My flashlight skimmed the far side of the room, revealing a dark shape hunched in the corner behind the toppled cabinets. My lungs constricted as I realized it wasn't an inanimate pile of debris. It was breathing, slow and uneven. Shaking, I inched closer, my beam trembling along the shape's outline. A figure lay curled against the wall, limbs drawn in as though in pain or despair. I couldn't see a face beneath the matted hair, but one thing was unmistakable. It was alive. I opened my mouth, no words forming. My instincts screamed at me to back away, yet sympathy flared, however briefly. What if this was another survivor, trapped down here with something far worse? The figure stirred, letting out a feeble moan. A thin arm extended, revealing bruised skin and ragged fingernails caked with filth. My heart lodged in my throat. All the terrors I'd witnessed urged me to run, yet I hesitated. Some part of me needed to know if this person could be helped, or if they might offer answers. I advanced another step, boots crunching on glass. The figure jerked, then tried to crawl away, an agonized whimper echoing in the stale air. I raised my free hand in a gesture of peace. Flashlight, angled slightly aside to avoid blinding them. In a trembling whisper, I managed something akin to reassurance, though I expected no reply. The figure paused, turning enough that I glimpsed hollow cheeks and eyes rimmed with exhaustion. My stomach twisted at the sight of teeth marks on their own arm, as though they'd tried to stifle screams, or worse. Whatever happened in this facility had clearly taken a brutal toll. With great effort, they rasped a single word, but I couldn't decipher it. I leaned in, struggling to catch it again. Erol, hal, enter. Instead, a guttural coughing fit seized them, and a dark spatter landed on the dirty tiles. My flashlight beam shook as I realized the substance was too thick and dark to be mere spit. They were in desperate shape, and every second of indecision cost them more strength. I reached forward, intending to offer support, when a strangled noise erupted from behind the cabinets, a sharp exhalation that didn't belong to the figure on the floor. Before I could react, something lunged from the shadowed corner, colliding with my shoulder and knocking the flashlight from my grip. I hit the tiles hard, jarring my spine. Darkness enveloped the room, except for the faint red glow of a failing emergency light overhead. Footsteps or scrapes thundered by my ear, mingling with the wounded person's shrieks. In a blind panic, I groped for the flashlight, fingers sliding across broken shards until I found the cylindrical metal. My hand closed around it, and I flicked it back on, chest heaving. The beam cut through swirling dust, revealing a flash of movement as whatever had attacked me scrambled behind the nearest shelf. Why? The wounded figure on the floor groaned, clutching at their arm. My nerves surged with adrenaline, torn between escaping or attempting to save someone too far, gone to walk on their own. I scrambled to my knees, scanning the shadows for the aggressor. The corner where the shape had hidden lay vacant now, but I felt the air shift with each panting breath I took. My fingers fumbled at the floor until they brushed a long, jagged shard of metal that might serve as a makeshift weapon. I gripped it, feeling the edge bite into my palm, fighting the urge to retch from fear. I turned back to the wounded individual, only to find they had collapsed, eyes rolling back as they let out a rattling gasp. A wave of helplessness crashed over me. Survian, who are we? The corridor outside might still hold a slim chance at escape, but leaving someone here to face unknown horrors felt beyond cruel. Even if they were barely conscious, my mind spun, searching for a solution. As I edged closer, I heard a rasping hiss from behind me. The same presence that had lashed out was still lurking, perhaps sizing up its next move. A shiver coursed through my body. I knew I had to act, even if it meant risking my own neck. I pressed a hand to the wounded person's shoulder, trying to rouse them while keeping the flashlight trained on the gloom. No response. Their breathing rattled, shallow and unsteady. If I attempted to carry them, I'd be slow, vulnerable to another attack. If I stayed put, we'd both likely perish. Footsteps grated on the shattered tiles, shifting my attention. The door shoots. The silhouette of something gaunt and wrong flickered in my periphery, my muscles locked in horror. Act in horror. There was no time to think. Clenching my makeshift blade, I hefted the unconscious weight of the injured figure and forced my legs to move, heart hammering as I headed back to the open doorway. Fear pulsed through my veins, but sheer desperation propelled me forward, hoping I could outrun whatever nightmare inhabited this forsaken chamber. I staggered through the doorway, balancing the unconscious figure across my shoulder and clutching the jagged scrap of metal in my free hand. My pulse hammered, and my arms trembled under the weight. Each step echoed against the walls, accompanied by the rasp of my ragged breathing. The corridor ahead was a flickering tunnel of gloom, punctuated by the occasional stuttering light overhead. Behind me, I heard that soft scraping of movement, like nails dragging over broken tiles. My only objective was to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between us and the cornered predator. I could feel the battered body's heartbeat against my collarbone, thready and uncertain, yet still there. A fresh wave of resolve fueled my aching muscles. I refused to let this person perish in the shadows. I struggled for traction on the damp floor, nearly slipping more than once. The corridor curved, forcing me to pivot sideways. The overhead pipes gurgled, releasing a puff of stale air that reeked of chemicals. My flashlight beam swung wildly, revealing nothing but more endless hallway. Every inch of my skin prickled with the awareness that whatever hunted us had yet to vanish. It was merely biding its time in the labyrinth's depths. A harsh clang from behind made me spin. Envelop coral de tonnelet tom del. Aided. My wounded passenger moaned softly. Stirring at the sudden jolt, I swallowed a surge of panic, pressing onward even faster. A bend in the corridor brought us to a chain-link gate, the kind you might find in a storage area or a utility zone. It was locked, with a heavy padlock. My heart sank. I glanced back, imagining the silhouette creeping ever closer, the air filling with tension so thick I could practically taste it. Gently, I propped the injured individual against the wall. Their eyelids flickered, consciousness drifting in and out. My hand shook as I jabbed my makeshift blade at the padlock's shackle, hoping brute force might free us. Metal screeched and vibrations jarred my bones, but it refused to break. If only I had a proper tool, or more time. Behind me, a scrape of footfalls. I whipped around, flashlight angled upward. My heart lurched as I spotted a lean shape slinking across the corridor floor, its limbs contorted at impossible angles. It paused just beyond the reach of my beam, eyes reflecting the light with a dull, hungry gleam. Slowly, it advanced, each motion accompanied by a wet rustling that set my teeth on edge. My instincts screamed that we were cornered. The chain-link barrier loomed behind me, locked tight, and the wounded figure lay helpless at my feet. Summoning whatever courage I had left, I brandished the jagged metal, hoping the creature would keep its distance. My mind churned with doubt. Would steel be enough to stop something that seemed only half bound by the laws of the living? The creature hissed, edging a fraction closer. A shiver crawled up my spine, but I refused to yield. Envelop. My grip on the metal shard tightened, knuckles whitening. A tense moment stretched, the air thick with dread. My wounded companion let out another weak moan, as if subconsciously sensing the threat. The hiss intensified, deepening into something like a growl, and the figure crouched. I lunged first, steel glinting in my flashlight's beam. The creature recoiled, scuttling sideways with a startling speed that almost unbalanced me. It let out a sharp screech that rattled my eardrums. My chance to act snapped into focus. Gritting my teeth, I swung at the gate's padlock again with all the strength I could muster. Woven? The metal scrap slipped off the shackle, sending me stumbling forward. Etiwi, my shoulder slammed into the barrier, making the chain link rattle violently. The beast hissed again, inches from my side, but it hesitated as though uncertain how to navigate the trembling gate. That tiny window of indecision gave me room for one last desperate strike. I drove the makeshift blade under the lock, prying with every ounce of force. A sharp crack rang out, and the padlock flew free, bouncing across the floor with a hollow clatter. I yanked the gate open, adrenaline roaring in my veins. The creature lunged, but I kicked the gate shut behind us. Metal clanged on metal as it slammed into the chain link, rattling it with vicious force. A guttural snarl filled the corridor, so close that the stench of decaying breath wafted through the gaps in the fencing. Without pausing, I scooped up the wounded individual, ignoring the protests of my strained muscles, and hurried deeper into the new passage. We left the screeching creature behind, though it continued to claw at the gate with an enraged fury. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out all else. Step by step, the corridor began to slope upward, air growing marginally fresher. Doors appeared in the walls, some jammed shut, others hanging crookedly on their hinges. With each door we passed, I peeked in, hoping for a glimpse of stairs or a sign leading to an exit, but found only dark, cramped spaces filled with debris. Finally, one door revealed a short flight of stairs swirling upward, the steps cloaked in a hazy glow. Relief welled inside me at the sight of even the faintest sign of an exit. I dragged both myself and the injured figure up the stairs, lungs burning with the strain. The hush of the corridor below gradually fell away, replaced by the distant hum of something that might have been wind. Each step felt like a promise of escape. As I reached the top, I found a narrow hallway, its windows boarded from the outside, but leaking pale light at the edges. A battered sign on the wall hinted at an emergency exit. I almost sobbed with gratitude. My flashlight revealed a simple metal door at the far end. No barricade in sight. The hallway's floor was cracked but manageable, and the stale stench of chemicals had faded to a dull tang. Balancing the unconscious person, I covered the last few yards in desperate strides. My hands flew to the door handle. It stuck for a moment, but with a fierce yank, it gave way. A gust of air slapped my face, tasting of rotting leaves and damp earth, but it was outside air nonetheless. Night's chill rushed in, carrying the faint rustle of branches overhead. I half stumbled, half collapsed onto a patch of weed-choked concrete. The figure's limp form cradled against me. The sky above was draped in heavy clouds, allowing only a weak glow from distant streetlights. Somewhere behind us, the labyrinth pulsed with secret horrors, but the fresh air gave me a flicker of hope. My arms throbbed from the effort, yet relief flooded every cell of my body. I blinked, disoriented by the open space, listening for any sign of pursuit. The building loomed behind us, a monument to everything unnatural and tormenting. In that forsaken town, my companion shivered, eyes still shut, but I felt a shallow breath. I glanced around, no sign of the gaunt figure or other shapes in the gloom, only deserted streets, swallowed by fog. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I dared linger on this spot. Part of me wanted to collapse, to let exhaustion take over, but instinct insisted we find safer ground. The entire structure creaked ominously, as if something stirred within its walls. Summoning the last scraps of my strength, I lifted the injured person once again, determined to put as much distance between us and the building as possible. The asphalt stretched outward, winding into the mist, offering no guarantee of rescue, but at least giving us a chance. With shaky steps, I pressed forward into the darkness, heart pounding, one arm supporting the silent figure at my side, despite the gnawing dread that the nightmare might follow. I clung to the small spark of hope that somewhere beyond these haunted ruins lay a world untouched by the horrors we had left behind. And for the first time since descending into those corridors, I dared to believe we might still find a way out of the shadows. I remember exactly how the thick fog swirled around my headlights as I pulled onto that narrow dirt road, the engine shuddering like it wanted to give up and turn back. The radio had long since faded into static, leaving my own heartbeat as the only sound apart from gravel crunching under tires. Everything about that night felt wrong, from the stale odor of pine decay wafting through the vents to the faint groan of the wind pushing through the towering redwoods. My instincts told me this place was a mistake. I should have listened. I parked in a small clearing where someone had hastily erected a flimsy wooden sign. The lettering, Camp Red Vale, had faded to near oblivion. A drooping chain blocked the path, dangling with a weathered "No Entry" plaque. It was obvious no one was supposed to come here. But that was exactly why I had come, spurred by a string of baffling disappearances with no leads and no explanation. People whispered that those who ventured into these woods never returned intact, if they returned at all. The first sign of trouble greeted me as soon as I stepped out. My boot landed on something soft, and the reek of dried blood assaulted my nostrils. I angled my flashlight down, revealing a ragged scrap of cloth half buried in mud. Dark stains bloomed across the fabric, too large to dismiss as an animal's misfortune. My stomach twisted. I had expected to see some evidence of a struggle. The stories practically guaranteed it. But the reality of that smear on my boot felt like a warning, a silent, undeniable statement that I wasn't alone out here. I moved the beam around, finding only the skeletal shapes of redwoods looming like ancient sentinels. Their bark glistened in the damp night, and a chill slithered down my back as I noticed how the fog clung to the tree trunks, forming ghostly shapes that seemed to watch. Adrenaline prickled my hands. making my knuckles ache against the flashlight's grip. A single deep breath, and I followed a barely perceptible trail of footprints leading past the chain. A little farther in, I found the remnants of what had once been a small campsite. It looked as though whoever stayed here left in a frenzy or got dragged away. Torn tops flapped in the breeze. A portable stove lay crushed, its metal bent into a shape that defied logic, almost as though some immense force had twisted it for fun. I knelt to examine a plastic container rolling in the dirt, its contents spilling a rancid odor that turned my stomach. Nearby, a water bottle with a tooth-like puncture. My pulse hammered at the implications. No ordinary predator did this. I shifted my focus to a battered notebook beside the fire pit. The cover was spattered with something dark, too similar to what stained my boot. The pages stuck together, but I managed to pry them open. Scrawled across the first legible section, "They see us. Don't light a fire after sundown." Heard it again tonight. A growl, but no animal. Eyes in the trees. My chest constricted at the final line, penned in trembling script. "If you find this, run." A gust of wind rattled the branches overhead, as though nature itself scoffed at my intrusion. I stood, every hair on my body raised. For a moment, I thought I heard something heavy shuffling through the underbrush, a muffled crunch that could be a broken branch or a footstep. My flashlight zipped across the clearing, but the beam revealed only swirling fog and the faint gleam of wet leaves. Despite the silence, I felt a presence, a prickling sense of being watched from multiple angles at once. It was a cold certainty slithering down my spine. Order. Following a narrow path deeper into the woods, I kept the flashlight low, trying to avoid too much attention. Shadows leapt at the corners of my vision, but each time I swung the light, they vanished as if never there. The trail led downhill, toward a shallow ravine full of brambles and gnarled roots. The stench of mildew thickened, mingled with something else I couldn't name. Almost metallic, like iron, left to rust in the rain. A splash of color caught my eye, a flannel shirt sleeve protruding from beneath a pile of leaves. I peeled them back, heart pounding as I discovered more signs of a violent struggle. Shreds of clothing, more of that dark dried residue. No body, no footprints, no clue where the victim had gone. A wet snap echoed behind me. I whipped around so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight. Through the haze, a figure, or maybe just a shape, darted between two massive trunks. It moved with uncanny silence, vanishing before I could process its outline. My lungs constricted, adrenaline flooding every cell. I forced myself to approach the spot where I'd seen it, hands shaking, nothing but bark and moss. The forest felt unnervingly still now. The wind dead, the temperature dropping, that rotting tang in the air only grew stronger. My mind wrestled with whether to retreat and call for backup or press on, but the image of those slashed tarps and that twisted stove pushed me forward. Something here demanded an explanation, and I wasn't leaving without at least a shred of truth. The deeper I ventured, the thicker the fog became, turning the towering redwoods into towering silhouettes. My flashlight began to flicker. Ingon denderl fused analyst. I slammed it once against my palm, praying it wouldn't fail me. The darkness pressed in, suffocating in its silence. Then, a distant noise, like a low growl carried on the wind. My skin went cold. Moo. It didn't sound like any animal I knew, more like the rasp of old wood being torn apart by something with a terrible will. I stumbled into a clearing, circled by squat, misshapen tree stumps. The ground felt strangely soft, my boots sinking with each step, as though the earth was saturated with something thick and old. At the center stood a makeshift altar of rocks stacked haphazardly, splashed with ominous stains. A half-burned photograph lay atop it, featuring a group of grinning campers. Red marker scrawled across their faces. My nerves screamed for me to leave. A sudden movement near the altar made my breath hitch. Something crouched behind the stones, a silhouette with elongated limbs, head tilted in a way that sent goosebumps across my arms. Two faint red glimmers met my gaze, unblinking. In the gloom, time froze. The thing rose slowly, impossibly tall, and a sensation like ice water poured through my veins. My flashlight guttered, threatening to die. And in that pulse of darkness, I heard a wet scrape against the ground, as if the creature dragged something behind it. My mind battered me with terror. Yet I remained paralyzed, caught between the urge to run and the harrowing curiosity that insisted on staying. The figure took a halting step. The red glimmers intensified. A guttural noise rumbled from its chest, neither fully beast nor human. My mouth went dry. This was no mere legend. It was real, waiting in the shadows, a living, breathing nightmare. Suddenly, the flashlight flared back to life, the beam slicing through the mist. The creature recoiled, letting out a hiss like steam, escaping a cracked pipe. My paralysis broke, and I scrambled backward, nearly toppling over the uneven ground. My heart hammered loud enough to drown out every other sound, but I could sense the thing's rage at my intrusion. As I tripped past the edge of the clearing, that hiss reverberated behind me, a promise of pursuit if I lingered another second. Everything in me screamed to flee, but logic and dread wrestled inside my head. I'd come here for answers, and now I had them. Only they were worse than any rumor or news report could capture. I clenched my teeth, forcing each terrified step away from the altar, away from those crimson eyes gleaming like embers. The wind kicked up again, carrying a dreadful odor. In the distance, the forest parted with an eerie hush, as though making room for the horror. that lurked within. I pressed onward, breath ragged, certain that this was only the beginning of what the redwoods had in store. I pushed deeper into the trees, struggling to keep my fear in check, even as my pulse throbbed at the base of my skull. The ground sloped gently downward, carpeted by a thick layer of pine needles that muted every step. Each time I glanced over my shoulder, I half expected to see the tall silhouette gliding through the fog, eyes glowing with a terrible hunger. Instead, the redwoods loomed in silent ranks, their upper branches twisting into a fortress of shadows that shut out the moon. A damp chill settled on my skin, prickling with the residue of what I'd witnessed. My mind replayed the image of the altar, the torn photograph, and the monstrous shape that rose to greet me. The realization hit me harder with every ragged breath. I was deep in territory that defied my expectations of the natural world, where warnings scrawled in a torn notebook weren't exaggerated rumors, but vital truths that people had chosen. A flicker of movement made my stomach clench, but it was only the silhouette of a broken stump. Gnarled roots jutted out like limbs, giving the illusion of a crouching figure. My flashlight flickered, a reminder of its fragile lifespan, and I mumbled a soundless plea for it to hold on. If it died, I wouldn't last long in this black abyss. No stars penetrated the canopy overhead, and the thick fog devoured any stray glimmer of moonlight. Eventually, the slope evened out, leading me to a gravel road that looked worn by time and neglect. Leaves and decaying branches covered large sections of it, and puddles of murky water reflected my flashlight's glow. The road curved out of sight, but I could just make out an old ranger station sign protruding from the undergrowth. Relief and dread mingled inside me. If there was shelter or any sign of civilization, that station might be it. Though I had no clue what I'd find inside, I stepped carefully over a fallen log that blocked half the road. A faint odor of ash lingered in the air, stirring a memory of the half-burned photo I'd seen earlier. My anxiety soared at the thought of more unsettling evidence waiting for me. Still, I forced myself to keep moving, hoping to reach the station while my nerves held together. At last, I emerged into a small clearing. A decrepit wooden structure stood in the center, slumped to one side like it had surrendered to the forest long ago. The front porch sagged under a rotting roof, and broken windows gaped like empty sockets. A twisted flagpole leaned precariously near the entrance, its paint flaked off in jagged streaks. The entire scene reeked of abandonment. But if I could locate any records left behind, maps, incident reports, clues about these vanishings, it might be worth the risk of entering. Gravel crunched beneath my feet, and the echo sounded too loud for comfort. My flashlight skimmed the porch. Splintered boards, rusted nails, a battered shovel left leaning against the siding. As I climbed the rickety steps, a wave of unease washed over me, as though the building itself had been waiting. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing a slice of interior darkness. The sensation of being watched prickled across my shoulders, compelling me to sweep my light around the perimeter before stepping inside. The interior smelled of mold and stale air. My boots sank into a layer of damp leaves scattered across the floorboards. The station's main room contained a deserted reception desk, a few overturned filing cabinets, and a pair of broken chairs. Papers were strewn everywhere, stained with water and coated in dust. The silence felt suffocating, my own breath rasping in my ears. I picked through the debris, bending to retrieve a warped folder that had slid halfway under the desk. Most pages inside were unreadable, ink blurred into shapeless smudges. A single clipping remained legible, a name and a photograph of a young hiker who'd vanished 6 months earlier. My stomach tightened at the date. It lined up with a few of those haunting rumors circulating in hushed town gossip. War, Sahabi, Katsiu, Guides, May, Gazi. The words presumed lost, stamped across the page, only confirmed the dread I'd been wrestling with. A scraping noise from deeper in the station nearly made me drop the folder. Every muscle tensed, instincts screaming for me to back away. I clenched my jaw and aimed my flashlight down a narrow hallway lined with closed doors. The corridor was choked with more leaves, dirt, and collapsed ceiling tiles. If anything lurked there, it stayed hidden. But the sense of presence was unnerving, like the hush that descends right before a thunderclap. My gaze drifted to a battered sign near the hallway entrance. Ranger equipment and records. With a shaky breath, I realized that if I wanted more concrete answers, I had no choice but to press on. Maybe I'd find an emergency radio, or at least a weapon more reliable than my exhausted flashlight. The memory of that twisted figure at the altar stoked my urgency. I couldn't face such a being unarmed. Stepping forward, I winced at every creak of the floorboards. Flickers of light touched peeling paint and gashes in the wood paneling, marks that could have been made by an animal, or something that only vaguely fit that description. The hallway branched off into smaller rooms, but the one on the left looked the least damaged. I approached, heart in my throat, and pushed the door open. The stench of decay blasted me, like a physical blow. I coughed, blinking back tears as my flashlight landed on the source. A massive pile of refuse, scattered clothing, and gnawed bones heaped in one corner. My stomach lurched violently, and I had to swallow hard against the rising nausea. Whatever had been using this station did so without remorse for any unfortunate soul who stumbled inside. Just then, the corridor behind me groaned with an ominous shudder, and I felt the distinct sense of a presence closing in. My flashlight jittered along the far wall, picking up a rusted fire axe clamped to a bracket, a relic of safer days. Before the reality of those bones could crush my resolve, I lunged for the axe, fumbling to yank it free. The metal squealed in protest before coming loose in my hands. A muffled thump echoed from behind, sending my pulse skyrocketing. I backed out of the vile room, axe clutched like a lifeline. My fight or flight response teetered on a razor's edge. Another noise, soft but deliberate, rose from the hallway, accompanied by a faint hiss of air through something that shouldn't be breathing at all. My flashlight flickered, threatening to plunge me into darkness. My mind screamed to run, but the knowledge that the forest outside was no safer hung over me like a noose. "Are you resting, Gareth?" Gritting my teeth, I forced myself to keep the beam steady. Each second stretched into an eternity as I held my breath, ears straining for any hint of a shape gliding through the rotten leaves behind me. In that moment, I understood something deeper. Whatever haunted these woods thrived on isolation and terror, feeding off the helplessness of anyone reckless enough to enter. A chill of certainty rippled through me, mingled with the raw determination that if I was going down, I wouldn't do it quietly. I gripped the axe with white-knuckled determination, edging back into the hallway where dank leaves clung to the floorboards. The air hung stale and unmoving, thick with the promise of something vile waiting, just out of view. My pulse thundered, the blood roaring in my ears. How? I could almost picture the corridor stretching into impossible lengths, like a nightmare that refused to let me wake. The faint odor of decay carried from the room I'd just fled, merging with the damp scent of mold creeping through the rafters. The flashlight stuttered ominously, threatening to cast me into complete darkness. I steadied my trembling hand, forcing the beam to stay trained on the path ahead. 1. Each step kicked up the leaves and debris, sending ghostly shivers of movement across the walls. Twice, I paused, convinced I heard breathing that wasn't my own. The hush that followed each pause made my throat tighten with dread. I reached a splintered door on my right that hung slightly ajar. Hello, the sign overhead, half eaten by rot, read records and equipment. If the old ranger station followed any logical layout, I might find a second exit, or at least some supply stash in there. A fierce curiosity tugged at me. Maybe I'd uncover more about the disappearances that haunted these woods. Yet my stomach churned at the thought of rifling through more grim paperwork, or stumbling upon another horrific nest. Bracing myself, I pushed the door open with the axe handle, wincing as the hinges let out a squeal. The stench within wasn't as overwhelming as before, though a stale odor of rust and old paper assaulted my nose. My flashlight flicked over an overturned filing cabinet, scattered documents, and a battered metal locker that someone had tried to pry open. Scratches gouged its surface, the metal warped where a tool, or something stronger, had attempted to force it. I nudged a few loose pages with my boot, discerning barely legible lines referencing unexplained animal attacks and excessive missing persons. The dates were spaced over decades, too many for coincidence. My heart pounded at the possibility that this torment spanned generations, not just the recent cluster of vanishings. A trickle of fear laced with morbid fascination compelled me to scan the room for anything more concrete. Shadows danced across the ceiling, making me acutely aware of how cornered I'd be if something slipped in behind me. For a moment, I imagined the tall figure from the altar leaning in the doorway, cutting off escape with its unnatural limbs. My mouth went dry, and I forced the thought aside, creeping deeper into the office. An old desk near the back wall caught my attention. Its drawers lay partially open, documents jutting out in ragged clumps. I knelt to shine the flashlight inside. The axe balanced under my arm. Most sheets were damp to the point of ruin, but a sturdy-looking leather-bound journal stood out among the mushy pages. I slid it free, heart pounding louder with every second spent in this vulnerable posture. The cover bore no title, just a single symbol etched in faint lines, some kind of stylized eye inside a twisted oval. My gut clenched with recognition, echoing a half-remembered motif I'd seen carved on a tree trunk earlier in the forest. I opened the journal and discovered an array of cramped handwriting in faded ink, the margins filled with sketches that made my skin crawl. Trees warped into monstrous silhouettes. Unblinking eyes stared from black hollows. Emiv W. Steer Diptoa Dild. Notes referencing midnight hunts and sacrifices demanded. My fingers trembled with every word I deciphered. A muffled thump from the hallway yanked me back to the present. I slammed the journal shut, adrenaline surging. The flashlight flickered again, as if the building itself wanted me blind. Anger mixed with terror inside me. I refused to let that monstrous presence toy with me any longer. I heaved the axe in one hand, the journal clutched in the other, and rose to confront whatever lurked outside. The corridor yawned before me, dim and silent. My breath hissed through clenched teeth. My mind conjured images of elongated limbs scraping across walls, eyes flashing red in the gloom. Yet I saw nothing but shifting shadows cast by my unsteady light. With each heartbeat, I sensed that malevolent intelligence creeping closer, patiently waiting for a slip in my guard. I retreated step by step, not daring to fully turn my back. The door to the main room, where the reception desk and shattered windows lay, beckoned like a borderline between the horrors within and the unknown outside. I told myself that the forest, while dreadful, might afford more places to hide. Staying in this cramped ruin with rotting floors and echoing corridors felt like suicide. As I reached the threshold, the boards groaned beneath my feet. A sudden flash of movement to my right made me spin, nearly dropping the journal. My flashlight whipped across the beams to reveal a mangled shape scurrying out of sight, no more than a glimpse, but enough to identify spindly limbs and a posture far too angular for any normal creature. The air stank of decay and rancid earth. A wave of nausea hit me. It darted away, deeper into the station, leaving only the wet scuff of its passage. Every muscle in my body urged me to flee. Clutching the axe, I bolted for the front door, which hung crookedly from a busted hinge. The memory of bones piled in the other room fueled my desperation. My boots slid on the muddy boards as I lunged outside into the clammy night, heart hammering against my ribs. Cold air rushed over me, bringing a swirl of pine-scented mist. I gulped it down like a drowning person reaching the surface. Behind me, the building loomed, windows black and hollow. The battered porch and leaning flagpole looked even more sinister under the wavering moonlight that now struggled through the heavy canopy. My flashlight revealed the yard, thick with weeds. The gravel road beyond cloaked in swirling fog. Catching my breath, I realized I still held the journal pressed against my side. Questions about its contents tumbled through my mind, each more unsettling than the last. Obligados Luis, contented use. Whatever haunted this forest seemed ancient, like it had settled here long before people built roads or ranger stations. And the cryptic references to sacrifice gnawed at my thoughts. Imudadai Nemuel had countless travelers or hikers served as offerings. Over the years, a distant hush emanated from the dark tree line, as though the entire woodland pressed closer, eager to reclaim me. My legs threatened to give out, exhaustion colliding with sheer terror. Yet I forced myself onward, away from the station's malevolent presence. The axe felt unwieldy in my sweaty grip, but I couldn't afford to abandon it. I picked a path, leading further along the gravel, hoping it would circle back toward a main road or some safe outpost. My flashlight cast shaky beams on twisted trunks and drooping branches that seemed to reach for me like hungry arms. Occasionally, I glimpsed flashes of red in the distance, but I couldn't tell if it was just my imagination playing tricks. One tightly down lugindry. Every nerve screamed for vigilance, reminding me that I was not alone, that the next step might trigger an ambush. A thick swirl of mist drifted across my ankles, obscuring the ground. Each crunch of gravel felt thunderous, a beacon to any predator lurking beyond the trail. The metallic tang of blood still clung to the air, though I couldn't be sure if it was a trick of my rattled senses. My mind raced with the question. How many had ventured this way, only to vanish into the gloom? Clinging to a fragile sense of purpose, I steeled myself to keep going. The forest wouldn't relent, just because I was scared. Whatever lurked here thrived on fear, using it like a net to reel in prey. Gritting my teeth, I gripped the axe tighter and trudged on, forging a slow path through the towering silhouettes and drifting fog, unwilling to succumb to the darkness that seemed determined to swallow me whole. I trudged forward through the fog-shrouded forest, the axe in my grip feeling heavier with every step. My lungs burned from the cold air that mingled with the reek of damp earth. Every crunch of gravel underfoot made me cringe, as if the sound alone might draw out. Glimpsed by the ranger station, the journal pressed against my ribs offered little comfort. Its cryptic sketches and references to sacrifices served only to stoke my growing sense of dread. And, in the overgrown road, led me to a stretch of underbrush, where briars and spindly branches tangled themselves into a living barrier. It looked as though no one had traveled this route in years. The road itself, once gravel and compacted dirt, was now riddled with gaping holes and shallow puddles reflecting the hazy moonlight. My flashlight flickered over a sagging wire fence, half buried in leaves, rusted metal giving off a dull sheen. Whatever boundary it once marked, nature had long since reclaimed it. I paused to catch my breath, glancing behind me. I paused to catch my breath. The darkness felt sentient, as though any moment it would congeal into that towering silhouette, with eyes like burning coals. Wind hissed through the pines, a hollow whisper carrying phantom footsteps. I tightened my grip on the axe, refusing to succumb to the terror pounding in my chest. The only escape, if it even existed, lay ahead. Continuing along the dilapidated fence, I stumbled over a weathered sign, lying face down among the roots. With effort, I pried it loose, metal scraping over stone. The lettering was so rusted I could barely decipher the words. Restricted access beneath layers of lichen. My lips thinned at the sight. It added another piece to the puzzle of these forbidden woods. A reminder that I was trespassing in a place kept secret, for reasons I might not want to learn. A chill wind gusted, tossing the fog in eddies around my ankles. I lifted my head to scan the environment. Gnarled trunks flanked me on either side, ancient guardians in a twisted cathedral of branches. For a moment, I imagined them leaning closer, drawn to the beat of my terrified heart. The notion felt all too plausible. Eerie, honest, ketubel. My flesh prickled at the memory of that half-glimpsed creature scurrying through the ranger station, the bones I'd seen piled in the corner. My flashlight landed on a narrow path, branching off from the road, partially hidden by a fallen tree. Tracks in the mud suggested someone, or something, had passed recently. My pulse hammered with indecision, torn between continuing on the main route or investigating. Caution warred with curiosity. The footprints were smudged, elongated, impossible to attribute to a normal person. Yet they pointed deeper into the gloom, beckoning me like an invitation I knew better than to accept. I swallowed hard, pushing aside thoughts of worst-case scenarios. Each breath felt raw against my throat. Away to the bijal, fire against my throat. The memory of that altar and the journal's cryptic drawings lingered at the edges of my vision. If some dark ritual or presence thrived here, perhaps these tracks would lead me to more concrete truths, or to my doom. A tremor coursed through my limbs. Even so, I found myself following the path, drawn by a mix of dread and a desperate need for answers. The undergrowth thickened. Low-hanging branches forced me to stoop, the beam of my flashlight bobbing awkwardly. The silence deepened, broken only by the snap of twigs underfoot and the distant drip of water. My mind conjured images of a predator, stalking close, muscles coiled, breath reeking of old blood. I pressed the journal closer to my side, as though it might protect me from the unseen. The forest felt alive in the worst way, possessed by an ancient malice that had endured countless seasons. A sudden clearing opened before me, ringed by enormous redwoods. Moonlight filtered through the canopy with surprising clarity, illuminating a cluster of stone markers arranged in a rough semicircle. My flashlight revealed intricate carvings on the surfaces, symbols reminiscent of the ones from the ranger's journal. I advanced carefully, each step echoing my heartbeat's frenetic pace. Stooping to examine the nearest marker, I ran my hand over the grooves. They formed spirals, jagged runes that meant nothing to me, yet radiated a fearful energy. The hair on my arms stood up, and I realized this clearing must be tied to the dark presence haunting these woods. Scattered around the stones lay fragments of bone, bleached white under the moon. They looked disturbingly fresh, despite their color. A bitter taste flooded my mouth as I suppressed the urge to retch. The center of the clearing featured a larger slab of rock, chipped and stained in ways that conjured horrific ideas of what might have transpired there. I remembered the references in the journal to midnight hunts and sacrifices demanded, my pulse racing at the thought of being caught anywhere near such a sight. The wind dropped to near silence, amplifying the ragged sound of my breathing. My flashlight flickered at the edges of the clearing, but no movement revealed itself. Yet, I edged around the slab, scanning for any sign of recent activity. Footprints similar to the ones on the path trailed around the perimeter, crossing and overlapping in a chaotic dance of inhuman shapes. A vile chill settled in my bones, compelling me to check the trees. Their trunks loomed like silent sentinels, thick with moss, branches twisting overhead. The sense of being watched prickled my neck, so intense I nearly whirled around, swinging the axe. Nothing, only emptiness, heavy with anticipation. Wah! A low moan drifted across the clearing, startling me into a half swing with the axe. The sound dissolved into a breathy sigh, as if the forest itself exhaled some buried sorrow. My flashlight revealed no obvious source, though the air felt charged, crackling with latent menace. Fear spiked, urging me to run anywhere but here. Yet a grim curiosity held me rooted in place, scanning every shadow for a hint of movement. Unable to stand the tension any longer, I moved to the far edge of the clearing, searching for another path. Thorny vines clung to the base of the redwoods, forming a barrier that looked nearly impassable. My stomach clenched. If this was a dead end, turning back would mean retracing my steps through that cursed station and the labyrinth of trees. I wiped sweat from my brow, scanning for a gap in the vines. A faint gap existed between two massive trunks, where the undergrowth seemed thinner. My gut twisted at the notion of pressing forward, but the alternative, lingering in this grisly stone ring, felt worse. Gathering my courage, I squeezed between the trees, the vines scraping my arms and snagging my jacket. The flashlight beam illuminated twisted roots underfoot, each step a battle, not to trip and sprawl face down in the loam. After wrestling with the vines, I emerged onto another narrow trail. This one sloped downward, a muddy chute strewn with slippery rocks. A trickle of water ran beside it, feeding into a small stream. An eerie glow from the moon made the surface glisten like liquid mercury. Stepping carefully, I descended, the roar of my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The trees pressed in close, their tall canopies blocking any sense of the open sky. Halfway down the slope, the smell of sulfur and rotten vegetation assaulted me. I gagged, nearly losing my footing. Something about the odor felt unnatural, a potent mix of decay and raw earth. I clutched the axe, mind circling back to images of strange rituals and bestial shapes. The journal sketches flickered in my thoughts, merging with the raw anxiety pulsing through my veins. The path leveled out near a murky pond, its waters opaque and disturbingly still. Skeletal branches from submerged logs clawed at the air. My flashlight glinted off the surface, revealing only an inky reflection of the treetops. I circled around the shoreline, footsteps rasping against slick pebbles. A tangle of reeds and brambles formed a partial blockade, so I used the axe to clear a narrow passage. Each chop echoed in the oppressive silence, setting my teeth on edge. At last, a patch of higher ground offered a vantage point. I wiped cold sweat from my face, heart pounding like a trapped animal's. The night air carried a faint rumble that might have been distant thunder, or maybe something else. I thought of the monstrous shape glimpsed at the station, the eyes that gleamed with unholy intelligence. Perhaps it prowled these banks, savoring my panic. Forcing myself to remain calm, I shifted my gaze to the black pond. Disturbed water lapped at the edges, triggered by some movement beneath. A ripple broke the surface, radiating outwards in small concentric circles. My stomach clenched. A primal voice inside warned me to back away, yet I found myself stepping closer, as though the watery darkness beckoned. The reflection of the moon rippled, distorted by an unseen force below. A jagged splash erupted from the center of the pond, sending droplets arching into the air. I stumbled back, raising the axe defensively. My flashlight caught only the last remnants of disturbance. Swirling water closing over something that vanished just as quickly as it appeared. Cold dread seized me. The notion that I was never more than a few steps away from being dragged into this foul water. I turned sharply from the pond, breathing hard, and spotted another winding path leading around a rocky outcrop. My flashlight wobbled, but I followed the track, eager to distance myself from the notion of hidden predators in the pond's depths. The forest closed in on both sides, thick with ferns and decaying logs. The earth felt spongy, each footstep releasing a wet squelch. Yet through the suffocating fear and the stench of rot, a flicker of desperate resolve drove me forward. Whatever roamed these woods had torn families apart, stolen unsuspecting travelers, and fueled the twisted legends lurking in the pages of the journal. Even if I wanted only to escape, I couldn't ignore the ominous gravity of this place. By survival and knowledge became tangled, each compelling me to continue along the trail, deeper into the malevolent heart of these haunted trees. I pressed on, stumbling through the soggy ground, where every step sank into muck that clung to my boots like quicksand. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather invaded my bones. The gnarled trunks of the redwoods arched over me, their branches creating a web of silhouettes against the suffocating moonless sky. My flashlight bobbed in my hand, the glow too feeble for comfort, but it was all I had. A subtle shift in the night air prickled the back of my neck. Like a warning, the forest itself was breathing, inhaling my presence and contemplating what to do with me. The path twisted along the rocky outcrop, every turn revealing more oppressive undergrowth. Twigs and vines snatched at my clothes, as if trying to drag me into the depths of this cursed domain. I found myself gripping the axe tighter, mindful that the hush around me didn't mean safety. Low-hanging mist wreathed the base of each tree. Between the trunks, I glimpsed pale shapes that vanished when I focused the flashlight, feeding the unshakable sense of being watched. The journal's cryptic references to sacrifices and monstrous hunts plagued my thoughts. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of the wind, hinted that something far older and more vicious than any mere animal was circling. The memory of those bright eyes glinting with malignant curiosity still burned in the back of my mind. I didn't realize I'd started to climb until I noticed the incline. Steep incline. The trail led uphill, stones jutting out from the soil at irregular angles. A trickle of water snaked down from somewhere above, carving shallow channels in the earth. My boots slipped on the wet slope, and more than once I had to use the axe handle to steady myself. With each labored step, the forest changed around me. The redwoods thinned out, replaced by dense thickets and twisted pines that creaked in the faint breeze. At the crest of the ridge, the ground leveled onto a broad plateau, covered in decaying needles. A fallen trunk formed a natural bridge across a narrow ravine. The drop on either side vanishing into blackness. My flashlight revealed a swirling fog below, as if the depths were filled with clouds rather than earth. I inched across the trunk, balancing the axe in one hand. The bark was slick with damp moss, and the slightest misstep threatened a plunge into whatever lay beneath. The entire crossing took a few agonizing minutes, each breath raw in my throat. I finally made it to the other side, heart pounding in my ears. Beyond a clustered barricade of branches and old vines, a faint glow flickered, orangish like distant firelight. For a moment, hope stirred. Maybe someone else was here. Perhaps another traveler or a rescue party. Then doubt twisted my gut. Nothing about this place encouraged optimism. The notion of a friendly campfire seemed too good to be true. Yet I couldn't ignore the possibility that I wasn't the only person left roaming these woods. Pushing the branches aside, I followed the glow. The air felt hotter, stifling even, carrying the scent of wood smoke tinged with something acrid. My flashlight beam cut through the haze, and I began to see a faint shimmer in the distance, like flames dancing in slow motion. My pulse quickened, a chaotic mix of dread and curiosity. If it was a gathering, it likely meant danger. But if there was any chance of help, I couldn't turn away. I braced myself and advanced, each stride deliberate on the uneven ground. A sudden gust parted the fog. Envoyel, can be very abodad star. Through the gap, I spotted multiple silhouettes, wreathed by flickering firelight. My muscles stiffened at the sight, tall, lean figures swaying in an uncanny rhythm, their arms raised toward the canopy. Shadows played across them in elongated, distorted shapes, giving an impression of stretched limbs and contorted torsos. My flashlight caught the glint of dark stains on the earth, and the stench of iron filled my nostrils. Whatever was happening, it was vile. Instinct told me to flee, but I remained rooted, mesmerized by the ritual unfolding. Low chanting vibrated through the trees, a guttural drone that made my skin crawl. No, I then made my skin crawl. The nearest figure turned slightly, revealing a narrow face, smeared with ash and something darker. Its eyes gleamed with a fervor that spoke of madness, or something else entirely. My pulse hammered, and the axe handle bit into my palm as I clenched it. Stepping behind a massive stump, I doused my flashlight to avoid drawing attention. In the flickering glow of the distant flames, I could see that these people, if they were human at all, had gathered around a charred stump protruding from the ground like a broken fang. Symbols that matched the journal's sketches marked the bark in swirling patterns, and a rancid odor mingled with the wood smoke. Every hair on my body stood on end, my stomach twisting with the certainty that I was witnessing the final moments before something truly abhorrent happened. The chanting intensified. One figure stepped forward, an antlered headdress crowning a gaunt head. Their silhouette loomed impossibly tall, casting a jagged shadow that raked across the circle. I could make out the faint outline of some object clutched in its hands, raised toward the sky. The others sank to their knees, arms still raised, forming a ring of silent homage around the central stump. Horror engulfed me as I realized I was watching a ceremony of sorts, one that mirrored every nightmarish detail the journal had hinted at. My boot shifted on a loose rock, sending a tiny clatter echoing through the hush. The chanting faltered, replaced by a collective intake of breath. My pulse thundered as multiple heads snapped in my direction. I ducked lower, clenching the axe so tight my knuckles ached. A raspy hiss broke the silence, and the fire dimmed for an instant, as though smothered by an unseen force. The circle parted, revealing a narrow path, pointing straight at where I crouched. Fighting the urge to bolt, I peered between the gnarled roots of the stump. The gaunt figure in the headdress let out a guttural command, and the others stirred. Their limbs moved erratically, as if joints had shifted in unnatural ways. Footsteps advanced through the brush. Each step crunched on pine needles in a frantic, searching pattern. My jaw clenched in terror, certain that I was seconds from being discovered. To die. A heartbeat later, a flicker of movement to my right. One of them, clad in tattered clothes, edges slick with fresh stains. They hunched low, head craning, sniffing the air like a beast. My breath caught in my throat. The entire forest went silent once more. The only noise my own pounding heartbeat. I knew if I waited too long, they'd corner me, drag me into that circle of flame and madness, summoning what little nerve remained. I rose in a crouch, forcing my aching legs to move. I took one cautious step backward, praying the gloom would cloak my retreat. Another step. A tangled root snagged my boot, nearly sending me sprawling. And somehow I stayed upright, stifling a gasp. The figure hissed, turning sharply. My mouth went dry, and I could feel its gaze sweep the shadows, searching. The group's chanting resumed. Louder, more frantic. The flames crackled, spitting sparks that danced in the air like tiny omens of doom. With my heart thundering in my ears, I forced myself to continue, retreating from the ritual's glow. Each step felt like an eternity. The axe a dead weight in my trembling hand. Leaves brushed my sleeves, and I held my breath, convinced even the faintest sound would bring them down on me. The chanting crescendoed behind me, followed by an awful shriek that snapped the final thread of my composure. I turned and bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, branches clawing at my arms. Whatever that circle represented, I wanted no part of it. Blind fear drove me as I fled deeper into the woods, mind racing with the certainty that escape was the only option left. And yet, somewhere in the back of my thoughts, the journal's cryptic words echoed in a loop, warning of an evil more pervasive and old than I could comprehend. If I didn't find a way out soon, the forest itself might seal my fate. I tore through the undergrowth, breath ragged in my throat, every rustling branch and snapping twig sounding like the shriek of a predator on my heels. The forest floor sloped downward, carpeted in a tangle of wet ferns and gnarled roots that snagged at my boots. Panic kindled the edges of my vision, driving me onward despite the burning in my lungs. My footsteps echoed with frantic energy, and I told myself that if I just kept going, if I never looked back, I might outrun the dread that clung to these woods like a living thing. The memory of that ritual lingered like a stain on my mind. The flickering firelight, the warped silhouettes, and the low, guttural chanting that curdled my blood. They had searched for me, those tall figures with eyes reflecting mania and a twisted devotion, as if determined to pull me into their ceremony. My flashlight beam bobbed in rhythm with my pounding heart. But even its narrow light felt too bright, a beacon calling out my location. I veered around a thicket of pine needles, forcing myself to slow before I barreled headlong into some chasm or a fallen log. The wind carried the faintest trace of that wretched odor from the circle. A coppery smell mingled with damp earth. My chest tightened with a combination of exertion and raw terror. Guilt gnawed at me too, a sense that somehow I'd intruded where no human should ever tread. The slope soon flattened, leading me into a region where moss-draped boulders loomed like watchful sentinels. Pale lichen clung to their surfaces, glowing faintly under the intermittent moonlights. I crept along, pressing myself against the rough stone whenever a twig snapped in the distance. Each time, my pulse spiked, convinced I was about to glimpse one of those robed shapes hunting me through the gloom. But no one emerged from the shifting shadows, leaving the silence all the more suffocating. At last, the mossy boulders gave way to a depression in the landscape. My flashlight revealed a half-collapsed tunnel entrance, framed by rotting wooden beams and corroded metal rods. A sign, too rusted to read, lay tipped against a stump. Maybe it had once been part of a mine or an old service tunnel. My instincts screamed caution. Enclosed spaces meant traps, dead ends. Yet the prospect of being exposed in the open, with that savage group prowling the tree line, felt worse. Easing closer, I peered into the opening. The darkness was absolute, consuming my flashlight's beam within a few yards. A draft of cold air brushed my face, bearing the tang of wet stone. I clenched my jaw, listening carefully. No chanting, no scuttling steps, only the rhythmic drip of water somewhere deep inside. The knowledge that I might be sealing myself in with unknown threats weighed on me. But the alternative was waiting for the cultists. If that's what they were, to catch up. Tightening my grip on the axe, I slipped into the tunnel, ready to spring back if any shape lurched forward. The interior smelled of mildew and old dust. By dust. Patches of mold clung to the walls in blotchy streaks, and a line of rotted railroad ties hinted that this passage might once have carried ore or equipment. My boots squelched in shallow puddles, sending echoes that rippled off the narrow stone corridor. The overhead beams groaned under my weight, though the passage was tall enough that I could stand upright without stooping. After several yards, the tunnel widened into a small chamber where broken crates lay stacked against one wall. My flashlight revealed tools scattered under layers of grime. Rusted pickaxes, shattered lanterns, coils of rope gone brittle with age. I rested a moment, trying to steady my frantic breathing, then rummaged through the debris in hopes of finding something, anything, that might help me survive. Most items were beyond saving. Metal fused with rust, rope disintegrating at the slightest touch. Still, I managed to salvage a small square of canvas that looked relatively intact. No sign of recent footprints, but that didn't mean I was safe. A rattle from deeper in the tunnel made me freeze. Heart lurching into my throat. I clicked off the flashlight, bracing myself. In the darkness, my ears strained, waiting for the slightest sign of movement. Seconds dragged on, my pulse thundering. Another faint noise, a shuffle, a scrape of something solid on stone. It took all my self-control not to bolt back outside. I told myself that if I managed to remain quiet, whatever lurked in here might pass me by. The noise receded, replaced by the distant trickle of water. Stupid stammer did. My nerves screamed that this place was no mere refuge. If forest was a crucible of dread, this tunnel felt like its hidden artery, carrying secrets that should never see daylight. Flicking the flashlight back on, I advanced slowly, ignoring the voice in my head that pleaded to turn around. The walls soon grew slick with condensation, and the ground sloped downward once again. Thin rivulets of water traced paths along the stones, forming shallow channels that fed into deeper recesses. My flashlight beam glanced off a metallic gleam in the distance, a collapsed barrier made of iron bars. The gate had twisted under some tremendous force. Its bars curved outward as if something had broken out rather than in. Past the ruined gate, the tunnel opened into a massive cavern. Stalactites glistened overhead, their tips reflecting my flashlight like malevolent eyes. The sound of dripping water echoed in a slow, mournful cadence. Slabs of rock jutted from the floor, forming uneven steps that led to a pool of black water in the center. My heart kicked up a notch. The air tasted stale, laced with a faint chemical tang. I swept the beam around the perimeter, half expecting to see monstrous outlines lurking behind the formations. Instead, I found symbols carved into the cavern walls. Some were the same spirals and runes I'd encountered in the journal's pages, and on the standing stones in the forest. Others were more complex, almost geometric, linked by lines that curved in unnatural angles. My skin crawled at the thought of countless hands, etching these icons into the rock over who knew how many years. If the ritual circle above was part of a grand tapestry, this chamber felt like the hidden tapestry's center. Approaching one of the symbols, I squinted at the dried residue that filled its grooves. And surely, that too dark to be paint, too thick to be mere moss. A wave of nausea rolled over me as I realized what it likely was. Biting down on a surge of revulsion, I forced myself to focus. If I'd come this far, I needed to understand how to escape, and maybe how to put an end to whatever was fueling these malevolent practices. A soft hiss from behind a column of stalagmites jolted me into a defensive stance. I raised the axe, flashlight trembling. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, from the corner of my eye, a pale shape slithered into the gloom. It was smaller than the gaunt figures from before, but just as unsettling. Long, spindly limbs pulled it across the stone in fits and starts. My heart slammed against my ribs, but I maintained my silence, backing slowly away from the cluster of jagged rocks. The creature halted in the shadows, head tilted, as though listening for me. My nerves screamed. If it detected me, I'd be trapped in this cavern with no easy exit, pinned between the twisted gate and whatever else lay in these subterranean depths. I steadied the axe, ready to lash out if it lunged. Amorhead, could you go down to prey? Seconds ticked by in a crawl, each breath tightening my chest. At last, the thing moved again, skittering further into darkness, leaving behind an unsettling hush. I exhaled shakily, knees threatening to buckle, unsure how many more of them might lurk in the gloom. I inched along the cavern's edge. The pool of water reflected my flashlight in quivering patches of light, revealing broken stone pillars submerged at odd angles. Strange lines traced the pillars, reminiscent of the carvings on the walls. Some ancient architecture had collapsed here, and if the shapes were any clue, it wasn't meant for normal human use. Skirting the pool, I spotted another passage leading away. Compared to the one I'd entered through, this route looked more natural. The walls rough and unworked, the ceiling low. It might lead nowhere, or it might be my only salvation. My gut clenched, every instinct torn between retreat and the faint promise of a way out. After a final glance at the black water and the carved symbols, I headed for the narrow corridor. Driven by desperation to escape, the passage forced me to crouch. Jagged ridges scraping my shoulders, cold trickles of water splashed my ankles as I moved. The air was thick, suffocating. If I got stuck down here, no one would find me. My flashlight battery displayed a warning flicker. Envelopanes on a bumtrika. I silently begged it to hold out a little longer. Newun. Each labored step brought me deeper, away from the cavern's malevolent energies, but into an unknown labyrinth of stone. At last, the corridor widened, revealing a steep, rocky incline. A small draft touched my face. A hint of outside air, or perhaps a different opening. My pulse soared. Clambering up the incline, I clutched the axe and my dying flashlight, refusing to let either slip from my grip. The stone was slick with mineral deposits, forcing me to wedge my boots into crevices and cling to outcroppings. After minutes that felt like hours, I crested the slope and found myself staring at a rough tunnel exit, partially concealed by a cluster of boulders. Outside light, pale and wan, filtered through, filling me with a surge of hope. Night still reigned, but it was open sky, not the stone ceiling. I wriggled through the gap, emerging onto a narrow ledge, overlooking a ravine, choked with towering pines. A biting wind snapped at my face, but I relished the feel of it. Peering down, I saw no sign of torches or robed figures. The ravine floor lay cloaked in swirling mist, but beyond, the faint outline of a hillside stretched toward a hazy horizon. Relief warred with the lingering terror inside me. I couldn't be sure if I'd truly escaped those who prowled the forest, or if I'd merely wandered into another corner of their domain. Still, the open air revitalized my determination to survive. Tightening the axe under my arm, I began the slow descent along the ledge, hunting for footholds. My flashlight's beam faded further, but I made every moment count, scanning for safe steps. When, at last, the beam died, leaving me with only the dim glow of the night sky, I swallowed hard and pressed on. Inch by inch, I climbed down, haunted by the knowledge that something monstrous dwelled under that forest canopy, and that it might still be searching for me. I felt the ravine's chill seep into my bones as I continued my descent, fingers numbed from the rough, damp stone. A thin veil of clouds drifted past the moon, casting everything in alternating shadows. Each step demanded careful balance on the slippery ledge, where the drop-off vanished into a swirling sea of mist below. An occasional branch of scraggly pine provided flimsy handholds, the bark peeling away under my grip, but I clung to them regardless. After what felt like hours, I found stable ground, a small ledge wide enough to stand on without hugging the rock face. Ahead, the ravine sloped gradually into a valley choked with gnarled bushes and jagged outcroppings. Low-lying fog blanketed the center, forming a grim ocean of white, but the promise of open space urged me forward. Perhaps I could navigate around the forest's twisted core, circle back toward the main road, or at least put distance between myself and the horrors I'd encountered. A thing of exhaustion flared in my legs, but the faint sense of freedom kept me moving. I worked my way along the valley's edge, searching for a path that wouldn't lead me into a tangle of briars. The moon emerged fully, illuminating the scattered debris of dead trees and fractured stone. Thin streams of water trickled down from the cliffs overhead, cutting shallow channels through the soil. Yaimt, when I crouched low to check for footprints, all I found were the swirling patterns of wind-blown leaves. Relief washed over me at the absence of those elongated tracks. At least for now, it seemed I was on my own. Yet the hush persisted in an ominous way, as though the land itself waited to see what my next move would be. Gritting my teeth, I forced a steady pace, following the valley floor, eastward, until I discovered a break in the dense undergrowth. There, a narrow trail, barely more than a deer path, led uphill, flanked by skeletal birch trees, whose pale trunks glimmered like phantoms. The axe weighed heavy in my hand, reminding me that terror still lurked in every shadow. A short climb brought me to a plateau dotted with boulders. Dense bits of moonlight revealed a structure looming beyond. A neglected cabin or shack, its silhouette leaning at an awkward angle. The roof caved in at one corner, boards missing from the walls. Normally, I would have turned away from such a miserable dwelling, but the thought of a place with 4 walls and a door was too tempting to dismiss. My breath rasped in my chest, each inhale catching on the dryness of panic. Yet necessity won. I approached cautiously, testing each step to ensure no hidden pitfall. The front porch sagged beneath my boots, the wood creaking in anxious protest. The door itself hung askew, held by a single rusted hinge. I nudged it open with the axe handle, revealing a cramped interior littered with leaves and broken furniture. Dust floated in the moonlight that poured through a gash in the roof, illuminating a battered fireplace on the far wall. Stepping inside felt like crossing a threshold from one darkness into another. At least here, the air was still, free from the immediate sense of pursuit. I scanned for signs of recent occupation, boot prints, discarded items, anything to suggest I wasn't alone. Only rotting planks, tattered curtains, and the faint smell of wet ash remained. Kneeling by the fireplace, I brushed away debris, unearthing a few fragments of charred wood. A quick check revealed no hidden compartments or leftover supplies. Exhaustion tugged at me, every muscle aching from panic and relentless movement. I eased onto a wooden crate that lay overturned, using my foot to test its stability. Though it groaned, it held my weight. Outside, the wind rattled the shaky walls, making the entire shack moan like a wounded animal. I prayed the roof wouldn't collapse. Allowing myself a sliver of rest, I gripped the axe and leaned my head back. Memories tumbled in my mind. The underground cavern with carvings etched in dried remains. The circle of robed figures chanting around a cursed stump. The monstrous silhouettes stalking the ranger station. Wara. My pulse still throbbed at the thought of how narrowly I'd escaped. A part of me dared to hope I'd gotten far enough that they couldn't find me. Yet the fear that they, or something worse, might roam these woods without rest gnawed at my senses. Gathering courage, I pulled the journal from my jacket, flipping through the pages. Despite the darkness, I relied on stray moonbeams to catch fragments of text and sketches. The intricate designs suggested a vast network, a careful ritual that drew power from the forest's oldest places. Words scrawled near the end of the journal repeated phrases like, "It demands, the hunger never ends, and only at dawn does it weaken." My heart pounded. If these cryptic warnings held any truth, sunrise might be my best chance of leaving this nightmare behind. A soft knock sounded against the cabin's exterior, as though a branch tapped the wall. Ice shot through my veins. I snapped the journal shut, clutching the axe. Another knock, gentler but deliberate. My pulse thundered in my ears. Could it be a stray animal? Wind? A trick? I rose from the crate and slipped toward the door, leaning sideways to peer through a gap in the boards. The night pressed against the shack, thick and silent. No sign of movement, no silhouettes creeping among the trees. Another knock, this time at the rear of the shack. I whipped around, nearly dropping the axe. Something was toying with me, testing my responses. The walls of the cabin felt too thin to keep anything out. Swallowing my panic, I crouched low, creeping along the interior perimeter, searching for cracks that might reveal a lurking figure. In the far corner, the boards had rotted through, revealing a partial view outside. A shape flickered past, humanoid, but wrong in the way it moved, slow and hunched. A faint rasping reached my ears, like strained breathing. I froze, barely daring to inhale. The shape paused, turned its head my way, then slithered into the darkness. My fingers clenched so tightly around the axe that my knuckles burned. The tapping noises resumed, circling the shack, each knock closer than the last. My mind raced. If I stayed, they would eventually corner me. If I ran blindly into the woods, I could stumble right into the arms of that chanting cult, or one of those monstrous figures skulking in the ravines. The journal had mentioned dawn, some elusive hope that the forest's hold might weaken with the rising sun. Glancing through the gap in the roof, I saw only the faintest glimmer of starlight. Dawn was still hours away. A scraping at the door jerked me from my thoughts. En pa edu door. Then a thud, heavy enough to rattle loose planks. My breath caught, and I pictured a gaunt form stooping on the porch, pressing a twisted limb against the wood. Another strike, and the hinge groaned. I realized I had only seconds before they forced their way inside. With trembling resolve, I swung the axe and lodged the blade into the rotting wall near the door, hoping to jam it shut. The metal bit deep into the old lumber. See ya. An enraged shriek tore through the night, followed by frantic scratching. The cabin's flimsy frame shuddered as something clawed and slammed from outside. Heart pounding, I snatched the remains of a broken chair, jamming it under the splintered door handle. The rattling intensified, the shriek pitching higher. I stumbled back to the corner, journaling clutched to my chest, every instinct screaming that I was seconds away from facing an abomination beyond rational comprehension. Outside, the howling hit a feverish pitch, then abruptly cut off. An eerie hush fell. Engol, cell, my muscles locked. The sudden silence more terrifying than any noise. Wind rattled the shack, or maybe it was that thing shifting its weight on the porch. Time slowed to a grinding crawl as I held my breath, praying it might lose interest. Then a final crash shattered the door. The axe handle snapped, boards tearing free, letting a cold gust sweep in. A warm silhouette hunched in the ragged opening. My eyes locked onto its shape. Dark, elongated arms, a craned neck that twitched unnaturally. My feet refused to move, pinned by sheer horror. With one last surge of will, I hurled myself out the hole in the back corner, splinters slicing my arms as I tumbled into the night. I hit the damp ground hard, knees buckling. The cabin behind me shook with guttural screeches, the creature thrashing at the spot where I'd been. Still clutching the journal, I forced myself upright, ignoring the pain in my limbs. The forest stretched out like a labyrinth of shadows, but I had no choice. I bolted into the trees, branches slashing at my face, every nerve ablaze with raw terror, and a singular desperate aim. Reach the dawn and hope its first light would break the spell of this living nightmare.